Let's talk for just a little while today about surviving giants. It's amazing how often and how many different ways giants and gigantic creatures are portrayed in movies, in books, in stories and stuff. When I was a little kid, probably my all-time favorite giant story was Mickey and the Beanstalk. But the giant in that is he's kind of like dopey and doofy looking. And at the end of it, when Mickey sort of conquers him, you almost feel bad for him because he's like this simple-minded, goofy sort of guy. On the other end of the spectrum, though, is for me at least, the worst gigantic creature in any movie is in the Lord of the Rings. I think it's Shelob. If you're like a Lord of the Rings person, you may correct me on that. This gigantic spider in like the worst. So I don't like spiders anyway, but the absolute worst scene in the entire movie is when you're looking. I saw this in theaters. It's almost like you're looking through the Hobbit's eyes and you can see his feet and the spiders crawling up. It's just, it's horrible. Just a horrific scene. But like right now, for example, in theaters, is it Kong versus Godzilla or Godzilla versus Kong? Apparently there's a huge market for Godzilla movies. I had no idea. Do you know there's almost like 40 of those, with like Godzilla and Mothra and all these different creatures and stuff. And then I feel like every Power Rangers episode, I was never super into those, but it's like every Power Rangers episode has them, or has the bad guy like transforming into some kind of gigantic version of himself, and then the Power Rangers transform and combine, and then they destroy half the downtown city that they live in, and then they just all go back to high school like there wasn't a bunch of destruction downtown. Question for you. What would you say in like movies or books or TV shows or something like that is your favorite giant or gigantic creature? I think we all understand that giants in their portrayal in movies and TV shows in a lot of ways are communicating this idea of a metaphor that we all face problems in our lives that seem like they're insurmountable, like there's just simply no way that we're going to conquer this, that we're going to get past this. But while in almost every movie, the giant is conquered if he needs conquering, there's a conquering of this giant or this gigantic creature, or they're slain, and there's this happy ending. But the truth of the matter is that in life, when we're faced with problems that we would consider to be giants in our lives, not everybody walks away successfully. Not everybody walks away unscathed. We all face problems and we all face big ones, but we don't always fight and win. And I don't know about you, but I really want to be the kind of person that when I'm faced with circumstances and difficulties and challenges and things that I would consider to be giants in my life, I want to be somebody that conquers those things. I want to be victorious. But when a problem comes, I don't want to be the kind of person that hides. Have you ever done that before? Have you ever found yourself with a problem? Maybe for you, the problem's at home. Maybe the giant in your life right now is something to do with mom and dad and your relationship. And so when you go home, the way that you maybe sort of fight that in your mind is that you hide. You go to your room, you shut the door, you eat dinner in your room, or at least you come out and get dinner and then you immediately go back to your room. But I think sometimes in life we find ourselves trying to hide, trying to avoid these difficulties. Or maybe it's a personal struggle that you seem to think that if I can just ignore it, that it's going to somehow go away. But what if, guys, you could conquer those giants in your life? What if there was a way that instead of hiding, you could deal with them face on and head on, and you could actually defeat them through the power of God? And better yet, what if it was the desire of God for your life that you lived that way? That the creator of the universe actually wants you and desires that you and I face the problems of our lives, face them head on, deal with them successfully, and come out on the other end of that all the better for it. I want to look at scripture for just a few minutes, and I want to see how we can survive the encounters with the giants in our lives. 1 Samuel chapter 17. It says, "And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched by the valley of Elah and set the battle in array against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span." Now let's move on to verse 17. "And Jesse said unto David," David's the hero in this story, Take now for thy brethren an ephah or a measure of this parched corn and 10 loaves of bread, and run to the camp to thy brethren, and carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, and look how thy brethren fare. See how they're doing, and take their pledge. And now Saul, verse 19, and they, who's the king, and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. And David rose up early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper and took and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the trench as the host was going forth to the fight and shouted for the battle. Verse 21, for Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage and ran into the army and came and saluted his brethren. And he talked with them, and behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the same words, and David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were sore afraid. So this day in David's life is really nothing out of the ordinary. He's, at least not how it starts, he's planning on working with the sheep again today. But this particular day, his dad says, hey, look, your brothers are at war. The nation of Israel is at war against the Philistines. And so while they're out to the battle, I want you to go. I want you to bring them some food. So David's like, hey, sure, that sounds good. And he brings some cheese, he brings some meat, he brings some corn, and he packs it all up, and he heads out to make the delivery. But he's really just simply sent to check on things and see how his brothers are going. Now, his brothers are warriors fighting for Israel, so undoubtedly he expects to see a war in some way, shape, or form taking place. But when he arrives, he sees something really unexpected. And the unexpected thing that he sees is a giant. This man is described in Scripture using measurement that we don't use any longer, at least the unit of measure. But if you were to look, you're going to see this guy's really over 9 feet tall. 9 feet. This guy's absolutely massive. And he's threatening the people of God. He's cursing the name of the God of Israel while the nation of Israel cowers in their tents. And he's proposing this. Instead of us all fighting, instead of us all, fighting and there's people dying and all this kind of stuff, let's clean all that up a little bit. Let's simplify it. And let's just do this. I'll fight one of your guys and one of your guys will fight me, a one-on-one battle. And whoever wins, that's the side that's going to be declared the victor. Sounds pretty simple. It minimizes casualties, but this guy is absolutely massive. I mean, can you imagine fighting somebody that's over 9 feet tall? I was in junior high and had the opportunity to play JV football. And when my JV football year was over, several of us guys got moved up to varsity. And we used to practice with these guys that ended up going to play Division I football. And I can remember very few times getting actually fully hit full force by these guys, because for the most part, they didn't need to. I mean, if I was running the ball and I came up against one of these guys that ends up going on to play professional football, all he had to do was push me, and that was it. I mean, I was just sprawled face first on the ground. I mean, because at 7th or 8th grade, I mean, I was pretty small. I was probably like 125, 130 pounds maybe. Can you imagine going up against somebody that's twice your size, at least twice your size? And not only that, but you have to fight him to the death. Like, the odds of you surviving are just super, super not good. So I'm sure it's quite a shock for David to see and experience, this giant of a man. Obviously, it's not every day you end up in a situation like that. And from David's perspective, probably it caught him off guard a little bit. It was unexpected. But you need to understand something, that from God's perspective, that was not unplanned. From God's perspective, it was not unexpected at all. So how do you survive these kinds of encounters with problems in your life that are unexpected? Well, the first thing is this, that survival is always a matter of timing. How and when it comes into your life is important. We don't like being caught off guard by problems. When we're caught off guard, we feel ill-prepared. Maybe you've had something happen and it's just so frustrating. Maybe you shook your head and you're like, I don't have time to deal with this right now. Because we do get caught off guard. Things happen last minute sometimes, and it's like, I can't believe, one more thing that I have to deal with today. And if a problem is heading our way, I'd rather have warning so that I can get prepared. But unfortunately, life doesn't always work that way. My brother just got through texting me last week, and he said that he was hiding in his basement with his wife My brother lives in Alabama, and there were some tornadoes in the area. As a matter of fact, the one that was in the area had already killed 5 people. It was headed directly for his house and his community. And this tornado had winds of upwards of 200 miles an hour, and it was about a mile wide. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen the devastation that a tornado can leave, but it's significant. But down in that area, they're unfortunately kind of used to that sort of thing. And so there's sirens that go off. You're going to get some kind of message on your device that lets you know that there's a tornado in the area and you need to seek shelter. And so there's a warning. But when it comes to problems in our lives that aren't tornadoes, that come in the form sometimes of these metaphorical giants, or sometimes they're even smaller problems, we don't get those kinds of warnings. I don't get a notification on my phone, hey, today at 2:30, something's going to go wrong. That would be nice, but it doesn't happen like that. For those who are walking with God, though, and following Him, each and every problem that comes your way, God has prepared you for it. You have been shaped and you have been molded to be a conqueror through Jesus Christ. He has a purpose in it. Now, it may not feel that way. It may not look that way, and you may not get warnings, but listen to this verse. Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that all things work together for good, to them that love God, to them who are the called according to His purpose." Listen, nothing, guys, is unexpected from the perspective of God. And He's a God who loves you and is in control. But you can be willfully unprepared. You can, by your inaction, as it pertains to the things of God, be unprepared for the trials and difficulties that are going to come your way. Psalm 37 verse 23 says this, "The steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord, and He delighteth in His way." You'll notice that these blessings and purpose come to people that are trusting and are following the Lord. It says the steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord, that there's a purpose and intent, and you have been prepared for these things. But if you are not, or could not be described as a good man or a good woman in the eyes of God because you're not pursuing Him, you're not going to be prepared. You're not going to be ready. See, you'll notice these blessings come for those that are living for God, but when we refuse that, we cut ourselves off from His leading and His protection. I mean, imagine that David ends up in battle against Goliath and God is not on his side. Imagine how that would go. If he didn't have a relationship with God, didn't care anything about God, perhaps if he acted somewhat like some of us do today, that I go to school, don't really care about God, not interested in the things of God, but I'm still going to plow headlong into all of these different battles against these giants. In that case, he would have been faced with a giant and he would have been unprepared. He probably would have gotten brutally killed. We're all going to face giants. So how do we go about facing them? Well, if you're like me, I don't want to feel like I'm just inching my way through life. I'm barely making it. I'm kind of getting annihilated by these problems over here, and I sort of squeaked by over here. And if I close my eyes and ignore these problems over here, maybe they'll go away. I don't want to live there. I don't want to go through life like that. I want to feel like I'm being successful, that I'm actually being able to conquer and get through these problems, and I'm doing it in a way that's successful in my life. I want to know that I'm handling my giants well. But notice also, survival is a matter of trusting. David hears that this giant is threatening the people of God, and he just determines, I'm going to do something about it. Look with me in verse 26. "And David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, What shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" In verse 27, these men relate to him what exactly would be done. It's communicated in the previous verses. And then verse 29, "And David said, What have I now done? Is there not a cause? And he turned from him toward another, and spake after the same manner." In other words, is there not good enough reason for us to fight? And the people answered him again after the former manner. And when the words were heard which David spake, they rehearsed them before Saul, who's the king, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him, thy servant." In other words, I will go and fight this Philistine. In the verses previous to these, the king actually offers a lot of money for the person that kills this guy. Not only that, but he offers him his daughter, his daughter's hand in marriage. Now, I understand that culturally we would be put off by that, and understand also that the Bible's not condoning this. It's just simply saying that this is what happened. So there's not only this woman's hand in marriage, but that means that you get to be married into a kingly line. And on top of that, he says that basically your family will not have to pay taxes for the rest of their lives. Financially, and as far as your inheritance and your heritage going forward, this is a pretty good spot in life if you can conquer this giant for these people. Those are pretty good rewards. I mean, as a reward to be married into the king's family, I mean, that alone is pretty significant. And I think we would all agree, though, that there are problems in life that you couldn't pay me enough to volunteer for. And this is probably one of those things. Nobody's willing to say, hey, your daughter's great looking and all, but there's just no way that I'm going to be jumping and getting my head cut off by this Philistine or run through with his spear. Just not going to happen. But David isn't in it for the reward. He's simply offended that there's a problem. There's literally a giant in the room who is defying the armies of the living God, and he's defying God, and he's blaspheming the name of God, and nobody's willing to step up and do anything about it. But notice with me these two verses. We actually skipped over these, and I want to come back to them for an important reason. Verse 28, and Eliab, this is David's older brother, heard when he spake unto the men. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David and said, why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightst see the battle. Verse 33, and Saul said to David, thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. In the middle of this craziness, in the middle of this young man, David, wanting to do what's right, determining in his heart that he has a purpose that God has established for him and he wants to accomplish something, he's met with two pretty serious criticisms. I mean, the first one in verse 28, his brother basically says, you're just here to see the blood and the gore and the guts of violence. You're a sick, twisted little kid. I mean, that's basically what he's communicating. And he's like, you're not here for help. You're not here to support. You're just here to be a rubbernecker, as we would say down south. You're just here to gawk, and you're just here to take in the scenes of violence. And then in verse 33, the king criticizes him. I mean, he gets an audience with the king, and the king's like, you're going to get absolutely destroyed by this guy. You're too small. You're too weak. You've never fought in a day in your life. This guy has been trained. He is the giant of all giants. I mean, there's no way that you're going to defeat him. You're not good enough. Let me ask you a question. Think about it for just a little bit and discuss it for just a second. Can you think of a time in your life where you were criticized for something? And maybe you'd feel comfortable sharing it, maybe not. Maybe you'd just simply say, yes, I can remember a time. But then perhaps what was it? Or at least, how did it make you feel? Put yourself in the shoes of David. These are pretty significant attacks against his character, pretty significant attacks against his motives, the reason why he actually was there in the first place when he truly did come just to help. And it is an attack on his purpose in this moment, that there's no reason for you to even be here. Some of you guys, you're going to experience those things at some point in your life, honestly, probably a lot of points in your lives. You're going to feel exactly like this man David did. Maybe you already have, but there's a secret to surviving those moments, and that is this: living with a confidence in God that you are doing life right. When I know that I am where I'm supposed to be in the eyes of God, it doesn't matter what criticisms I face from other people. When I know that my heart is right before the Lord, whether or not somebody criticizes my purpose, my character, my reasons for doing or not doing or saying or not saying, that's all really irrelevant if I know that my heart is where it's supposed to be. You see, David was confident in the purposes of God. The question, are you doing what God wants you to do, is a difficult question for most of us. I mean, if I was directly in your classroom and I came right over to you and I asked you, my eyes, I'm looking you right in the face, and I said, do you know that you're doing what God wants you to do right now with your life? That's a hard question, but understand it shouldn't be. That really should not be that difficult of a question. You should be able to very quickly and very easily say, yes, because I'm in the Word. I have a right heart towards Him. And at every moment of every day, I'm looking for what does God want me to do right now? And I just lived there. That's where David's life was. He was confident in the purpose of God, that him being there at that moment in front of that giant was not an accident, that he was supposed to be there. So David knew, this is what God told me, so I can act based on my knowledge of God. You say, okay, well, what is it exactly that God communicated to him? Well, in the case of David, we won't go back and look, but if you to go back a couple chapters, just a little previous to this, you're going to see that David was actually anointed to be the king of Israel, which means that he's not going to die at the hand of a giant. It's not even possible because he wasn't the king yet. And God specifically said, through the hand of Samuel, a prophet, you are going to lead Israel. So I think in a very practical sense, David knew there's no way really this giant can kill me because I know that God's hand is on my life. Now, it wasn't a source of arrogance or pride for him. It was just, hey, I'm willing to step up. I'm willing to put my life on the line because God has promised me his protection. David was confident in the protection of God. Verse 34, and David said unto Saul, thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine. And this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing that he has defied the armies of the living God. Verse 37, David said, moreover, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of the Philistine. And Saul said unto David, go, and the Lord be with thee. You see, David had a track record of battles that the Lord had helped him to win, and so it encouraged him in this battle. But here's the truth. Failing to face giants with the help of God now makes giants later on in life seem truly impossible. Guys, I can't stress this enough. Teens, pay attention to this. If you are not right now fighting the giants and the problems and the difficulties and struggles of life right now with the help of God, when those problems get bigger and those giants get larger in life down the road, it'll be way harder for you to trust God. Way more difficult. You got to learn to do it now. See, David saw God protect his life when he killed both a lion and a bear that was trying to attack his sheep. And because he saw that, David's like, hey, going forward, I believe I really can take care of this giant because I've already seen what God did in my life in these other instances. He had experience. Now, that's not to say that Goliath wasn't a seriously big guy and this wasn't a really serious matter, but David had a past experience of God's protection, so it made his next step easier. There was, not too long ago, there was a naval officer that was addressing a graduating class of some students, and he challenged them on something that really stood out to me. The slogan of that university was, what starts here changes the world. And that really resonates with the younger generation. They feel empowered. They want to make a difference by standing together. But then he challenges them to determine each and every day to make their bed. And the point behind it is this. Being a world changer demands that you have commitment, that you have a sense of responsibility, that you have a sense of discipline. If you're going to do something big like that, but you're not willing to do something as small and as easy to do on a daily basis as just simply making your bed, it doesn't make sense then that you're going to be able to conquer something bigger on down the road. And man, that's such a great point. I mean, for example, and I'm not saying this to bash anybody, I just want you to think about this for a second. Let's say that we take a student who can't ever seem to make it to class on time. They're always late. And let's say that their report card is full of a handful of zeros on assignments that they've just simply not turned in. And they don't like to listen to authority. Is it reasonable that same student, that same individual down the road is going to have people that want to hire them? And beyond that are going to want to hire them for a well-paying job, a high-paying job? Probably not. You see, if you're not going to be faithful in the small stuff and you're not going to conquer the small things in life that you really have easy access to and control over, how is it that you expect down the road to be able to conquer some of the bigger problems and the bigger struggles? Now, again, my point's not to slam anybody, but to simply say the giants of now need to be conquered well in your life before you're going to be ready for the larger ones later. Moments ago, I mentioned Psalm 37:23. It says, the steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord, and he delights in his way. But listen, just because you're a Christian doesn't mean God's behind everything that you're doing. It doesn't automatically mean that you have his guidance and direction, but it does mean that you have access to it. But a Christian can go their own way. They can do their own thing. They can say no to the directing of God, but they're still going to be facing giants. You're still going to face those struggles. See, David never would have entered into battle with this man unless he knew he had the protection of God. I mean, how stupid would that have been? I mean, to be like, hey, those rewards seem worth it. Yeah, fantastic. I mean, because I'm telling you right now, the men that were on the battlefield, the Israeli warriors that were there, they're going, what good is that stuff if you're dead? Like, I can't marry your daughter if I'm dead. That doesn't even make sense. And so the reward was hardly worth it in their mind, but David was confident in the Lord because he knew God rewards those who have a heart for him with protection. And he's saying, I've seen him do it before, and I believe that he'll do it again. Guys, David was confident in the power of God. Verse 38, and Saul armed David with his armor, and he put a helmet of brass on his head, and he armed him with a coat of mail. And David girded his sword upon his armor, and he essayed to go, for he had not proved it. And David said unto Saul, I can't go with these, for I've not proved them. And David put them off of him. And he took his staff in his hand and chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook and put them in a shepherd's bag which he had, even in a scrip, and his sling was in his hand. And he drew near to the Philistine. David is a young boy at this point in life, and Saul here is not only a grown man, but he's a big guy. As a matter of fact, he's described in scripture as being like head and shoulders above everybody else in town. And King Saul puts his armor on David. So you can imagine he's this little kid. He's got this giant coat of mail armor on. He's got this brass helmet on. And he's like, I've never fought in this stuff before. I can't use this. It's not familiar to me. And it would be stupid and foolish for me to go to battle with this Philistine wearing it. And so he takes it off. I mean, if you're going to battle, you want to be wearing the right gear. I mean, in war back then, there's 1,000,001 different ways that you could get injured. I mean, swords and spears and arrows and chariots and all kinds of things going around every which way. And honestly, a lot of times, if you look back historically, guys didn't die by being dealt some kind of like death blow. Oftentimes, you died by getting some kind of scrape or some kind of like minor wound, and you got an infection later on. So like avoiding getting hurt was a big deal. You did not want to get injured. But David rejects this armor. Why? It was because it wasn't what he was trusting to get him through this. And man, what a great point this is. When you face giants in your life, the problems and the challenges, whether big or small, what are you trusting to get you through? See, it made sense in a lot of ways for David to wear armor, but he's like, I'm not trusting in this. But what he did do is he went with what he was familiar with. Psalm 20 verse 7 says this, some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. Being prepared is important. There's some value to that for sure. But what is your trust in? See, David still went prepared even though he didn't bring the king's armor. He just went with a familiar weapon and a familiar God, the God that he'd been serving for years. A question. I want you to think about this for a second, discuss it for a little bit. What in life gives you a sense of security? I mean, what is it in life that makes you feel safe? Now, for some of you, it's like, hey, I've got a stuffed animal or 5. But what is it that makes you feel safe? All right, so full disclosure, one of the things in my life that's always made me safe is that I've always had a blanket. I've only had like 4 maybe in my entire life. I had my baby blanket, and then that one, like I kicked a hole through it because it got so old. And then I've graduated a couple others, but the one that I've got now I've had since I was living with my parents, like, 12, 13 years ago. So this is it's my safety blanket, right? So it gives me a sense of security, sort of. I also have an actual security system in my house. I mean, it's not really anything fancy, but it's enough to, if anybody came into my house in the middle of the night that was unwanted, I would at least know about it and be able to get up and at least hopefully handle it. So we have different things in our lives that give us this sense of security and sense of safety. I drive a minivan too, and honestly, the size of it kind of makes me feel a little bit safer. But David learned earlier than this moment that his safety came from the power of God. Guys, survival is really also a matter of just simply reaching out and taking it if you're following God. Armed with confidence in God, his purpose and his protection, David moved forward. And I love this. Let's read this together. Then said David to the Philistine, thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into my hand, and I will smite thee and take thy head from thee. And I will give the carcass of the hosts of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saves not with a sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. And it came to pass that when the Philistine arose and came and drew nigh to meet David, listen to this, that David hasted and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. And he put his hand in his bag, and he took thence a stone, and slang it, and smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. Now you need to, in order to fully grasp the magnitude of this point, right, that survival is a matter of you going out in the power of God and just grabbing hold of it and pursuing after it. You got to understand the scene here. So David is standing in the middle of a valley. He's on one side. He's got the encampment of Israel behind him. Visually speaking, there's nobody on his side in front of him, right? That's a key point. However, on the other side, behind Goliath, is the entire Philistine army. So visually speaking, it's not the direction you want to go. Not only is there the Philistine army, but there's this dude that's like 9 feet plus in front of him. And he's like risen off of the rock that he was sitting on, and he's moving towards David. With that visual in front of him, David gets up and runs towards Goliath. Like actually just pursues this victory. Because David was so intensely convinced, because he knew God had his back. He knew he had a place of righteousness in his own heart. He knew that God was going to protect him, that God had a purpose for his life and a plan for his life, that he said, you know what, I'm just going to go after this victory. I'm going to pursue, and I am going to take down this giant, not in my own power, but because of the power of God that has been resting on my life ever since way back when. Listen, guys, you're going to face big giants in life. You're going to face them that are going to seem like Goliath. They're going to seem like a problem is 9 feet tall. And if you do not have a heart for God, it's going to be insurmountable for you. It's going to have the potential to conquer you instead of you conquering it. But man, if you do have a heart for God and you've been pursuing him, and you're looking at a problem in your life and you're saying, Lord, please just help me as I navigate this. God will provide a way for you to conquer. Faith in God and conquering the struggles of life requires action. You know, I've spent enough time around students and people in general to know that a lot of times when we're faced with struggles, we freeze up because we're afraid. We see giants in our lives and we struggle with fear. Do you know what will enable you to grab hold of the victories in life? Knowing God. Because you know, hey, God has a purpose for this. His timing in this is not off. It's not unexpected. And if I've had a heart for God up till this point, I know that he's prepared me for this moment. And he's given me wisdom to know what decisions to make and what decisions to avoid. And based on that, I'm just going to move towards a place of victory. Because if you don't have that relationship with God, you don't know him, you don't know his purpose for your life, you don't know his plan for where you are right now, you don't have a sense of this is where I'm supposed to be, then expect those giants in your life to oftentimes kick your butt. You're not going to have this understanding of the God that's in control. And as a result, those giants are always going to seem big. They're always going to seem insurmountable. But some of us, man, we need to stop acting defeated and get into the Word so you know more about this God that's all powerful, that has a plan, that has a purpose, and this God that wants to give you victory over the giants that you're facing. Instead of embracing fear, embrace God, who has the power to give you the victory. Let me pray with you and I'll let you go. Lord, thank you so much for your word. Thank you for truth. I pray, God, that you would help these students as they watch and listen, God, to recognize they are going to face giants in their lives. They're not going to be in the form of perhaps an individual like Goliath or some gigantic spider, but they are definitely going to come in the form of problems and difficulties and trials, whether they're at home, at school, in the workplace one day, in our relationships, in our friendships. God, they are coming, and some of us are experiencing those right now. But Lord, I pray that you'd help these students to understand that with you, they can claim victory. They can find hope. Recognizing you have a plan for them. You place them in that situation on purpose for one of two reasons. One, Lord, to bring about victory because they've been pursuing righteousness. But the other may be this, Lord, that they've been placed there to recognize that they've not been clinging to you. And sometimes, God, we need to suffer a couple failures. Sometimes we need to feel like a failure so that we recognize that we do truly, truly need you in our lives. So God, I pray that you would help students to rise up in their own lives out of a sense of fear and into a place of victory, recognizing that they can conquer through you and in you. God, give them victory, give them hope. For it's in your name we pray. Amen. I'm going to toss a couple questions your way so you can put these up on the screen, or as they come up on the screen, you can hit pause and discuss for just a little bit. Thank you guys once again for the opportunity to connect with you. Take care.